Should we therefore leave the European Convention on Human Rights? 0344 499 1000. Let's get a couple of voices on this. Natalie Bennett is the former leader of the Green Party, and Ben Habib, former Brexit Party MEP, both with us. Good afternoon to you both. Natalie, first of all, it's been around for 70 years. It's arguably done some good work. Nobody disputes its reason for coming into being in the first place, but it's had its day and we don't need it anymore. True or false?
Absolutely false. And if you look at the history, and I'm really glad that you set out the facts there, this was drawn up by a UK MP and lawyer. The building in which it sits in Strasbourg is designed by a UK architect. We were the first country to sign up to this. This was setting the foundation of the rights-based rule of law system, which has more or less, not perfectly, but provided some sense of security and stability over the past decades. And now we have a situation where we've got a Tory government which is no answers to the cost of living crisis, so many areas of policy like energy policy in absolute chaos, and tanking in the polls. And I think you've really got to look at what's happening here is we've got this trial balloon. We've got all of these people like Robert Jenrick and supposedly other members of the cabinet saying this. And then a number 10 spokesperson, unnamed, is saying, well, no, of course we can't do this. This is really playing politics, grabbing the front page of the Daily Express or the Telegraph. But this is deeply dangerous in a world which, as the Integrated Review Refresh came out, the government's own paper came out at the start of this year, was saying this is a really volatile world. Look at Niger, look at Sudan, look at what's happened in Ecuador today. We need to be fighting for showing support for the rule of law, for human rights, and yet this government is sending signals that are absolutely opposite.
Ben Habib, it's dangerous if we start pulling out of conventions such as this. What do you think, Ben? Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon. Just a couple of points, if I may, before I answer that question, Ian. The European Convention of Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights was established in principle, as Natalie and you have said, with the UK being a prime mover behind it, to keep Europe under control, because it was European countries that just couldn't stop themselves from starting wars and abusing human rights. So it was for the protection of the European nations that we went into it. The notion that the British government, our parliamentary system, one of the oldest modern parliamentary systems in the world, one that actually delivered human rights first and foremost, way ahead of all these other countries in Europe, and actually was a force for bringing stability to Europe when they couldn't control themselves. The notion that we need to be controlled by a court over which we have no influence, where the British people's voice cannot be heard, which is entirely unaccountable, which goes on making laws as it chooses and against which we cannot kick. We cannot derogate from the rulings that this court makes. That notion is fundamentally flawed. At the heart of Natalie's argument is that the British people and the British parliamentary democracy cannot be trusted. And I absolutely disagree with her on that. I think we can be trusted a hell of a lot more than the European Court of Human Rights can.
Yeah,
that's the first thing.
Isn't that the point, Natalie, that there's a sense from many people, I think this is what Ben is getting at, that this overstretches its remit somewhat. The idea that the European Convention of Human Rights, with any of those, I think it's 18, 19 articles within it, that any of those should stop a government implementing its own immigration policy is not what it was designed to do.
2 points in response to Ben. First of all, he said that it was set up because European nations couldn't stop making war on each other. Well, of course, what we have is a situation where the European nations that aren't members of the ECHR are Russia and Belarus. And Russia, of course, has, in utter defiance of the international rules, the rule of law, invaded its neighbour Ukraine, sought to annex it, has indeed annexed parts of it. So this surely is the time to stand up against that kind of action by remaining part of nations sticking together, obeying those principles of the rule of law. But more than that, what we're talking about here are international principles that are holding across the world. And we have a government, we have a hard right government that is not living up to those principles. We've just seen with the recent immigration bill, the UNHCR saying that it is breaking international law. And that's what The experts are saying that's very clear. So we have to hold our government to these standards because, quite frankly, they're not holding themselves to these
Ben
standards.
Habib, how would you respond to that?
Well, I mean,
our government can't be trusted.
I know. I mean, what Natalie is effectively saying, and people who argue that we can't leave the convention are saying, is that the British parliamentary democracy cannot be trusted. And I just dismiss that outright. But the other thing that I just, on point of detail, Natalie, the illegal migration bill has a specific carve-out for rulings of the European Court of Human Rights because it recognises that the Secretary of State would have to take into account ECHR rulings which are binding on the United Kingdom. The idea that, I mean, I wish this government had the strength to actually derogate from the ECHR and to say, notwithstanding ECHR rulings, we will do X, Y, and Z with those people who cross the channel illegally. But we don't have a government that has the courage to do that. We don't have a government that has the courage to actually stand up and fight for the British people. This government, when Robert Jenrick says, you know, we're going to put it in the manifesto to get the ECHR removed from, removed as the Supreme Court of Human Rights in the United Kingdom, the reason he says he's going to put it in the manifesto, rather than just getting on and doing it, is because they're never going to do it. I just make one other point, if I may. There are two technical reasons, again, which would cow our government from leaving the European Court of Human Rights, leaving the European Convention. The first is that it signed into the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement, which, we've seen repeated evidence of our government not having the courage to stand up for Northern Ireland. So there's absolutely no chance of them having the courage to do something in breach of the Good Friday Agreement. And the other thing to note is that, notwithstanding the fact that the ECHR has nothing to do with the European Union, and the EU itself refuses to sign up to the ECHR, and the reason being because it does not want a court higher than its own European Court of Justice. But notwithstanding the fact the EU has nothing to do with the convention, we have made a commitment in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. The same government that Natalie casts as hard right has signed a commitment to the EU in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement that we would not leave it. So we're not leaving. It's Robert Jenrick just, playing the 24-hour news cycle.
And I sense Ben is right there, Natalie. I mean, this is a lot of Tory MPs, and there'll be many of our viewers and listeners, when you called the Conservative Party hard right, that would have been just spitting out their muesli at hearing that, thinking, really, what, this lot, hard right? For many Conservative voters, they're anything but. But on the point of the courts, what is wrong with the courts in this country that have decreed that, for example, Rwanda is legal? Why do you not trust it at that level?
First of all, the courts at the moment are saying that Rwanda is not a safe place to send people. That's the current level of court ruling. Of course, we're working through the appeals and the next appeals and the counter appeals. But it's very clearly obvious that Rwanda is not a safe place to send people. Actually, I've got to credit and agree with Ben and say it's great that he acknowledged that there's two enormous things that stop this happening, one being Northern Ireland and the other being the way it would absolutely destroy judicial and policing cooperations with the EU. Both of those are facts. And Ben is absolutely right. This is the government playing politics. But you just look at the state of the world, the volatile state of the world, the instability, the insecurity. This is the government playing politics for domestic reasons. But the world is noticing. The world sees what's happening. British news gets covered very widely around the world. And so we are doing real damage. We are being seen to line up with Putin, line up with Lukashenko, line up with President Z.
That's not right.
How are we lining up with Putin? But Ben, you want to come in on that? We're lining up with Putin.
Those are the two European countries that are not signed up to the ECHR. So
the European...
Russia were signed up, were they not, and then got booted out?
Well, because they're at an unacceptable level. So we're lining up with them by saying, well, we're going to follow you out. We're following you out.
Natalie, come on. I mean, the notion that the United Kingdom could ever remotely be anything like Russia when we are the second largest contributor to the fight against Russia in Ukraine. We are a bastion of promotion of human rights, not just in this country, but internationally. We did that when we didn't have to do it. When we had an empire, we were championing human rights across the globe. You've got to read your history on that. There's no way that you can castigate the United Kingdom and put it in the same bracket as Russia just because we wish to leave the ECHR. But I've got to make one more point.
All right, very quickly, Ben.
So we have to leave the European Court of Human Rights. We absolutely should leave it, because the European Court of Human Rights, as I mentioned at the outset, is unaccountable. It makes up laws as it goes along, and then those laws become binding in the UK. It is thoroughly undemocratic and completely wrong. There is no mechanism the British people have to hold this court to account. And yet it's the EU that bangs on about the fact that court shouldn't be above being held to account. It's the EU that castigates Poland over its judicial reforms. The ECHR is the worst form of court, an unaccountable body of people making up law on the hoof and enforcing it in the United Kingdom amongst other countries.
And Natalie Bennett, just run that past me again. The United Kingdom is no better than Putin's Russia. Why?
I didn't say that. I said we were lining up with them.
How are we lining up with Russia?
Russia was thrown out of the ECHR. If we walk out the door after them, I think you can see the line.
So anyone that walks out follows Russia, because by dint of the fact they're not in it?
Well, if you were saying we're not going to sign up to long-agreed international rule of law situations, just as China doesn't...
I think Russia were kicked out rather than walked out.
We're following them out the door.
So the fact that you also leave something means you're the same as Russia?
I didn't say same. I said you're lining up with, which is not. But
implicit
saying they're the same.
Implicit in lining up with is that there's some synergy between us and Russia.
Well, if you look at the situation around the world at the moment, we have a world that's splitting into two camps of authoritarianism, camps of military force, and people who are continuing to stand up for the rule of law, considering to stand up for long-term
So you think
rights,
we're moving into the military force sphere, like Putin?
In terms of... do we want to line up with the Scandinavian countries? Do we want to line up with countries like New Zealand, Costa Rica, countries that are seen as real world
But it's not one or the other, is it?
Human rights, just because rule of law.
If you happen to believe that there is something fundamentally flawed about the human rights and the European Convention of Human Rights, and you decide, because you've looked at it and intellectually it is not working for your country, which I think is the assessment that some people like Ben are making, it might have served a purpose once upon a time, but not now. That doesn't, by definition, put you on a footing with President Putin and Russia. You can't really believe that, Natalie.
What it comes back to is that we can't do this, as Ben has said. This is gesture politics. It's dog whistle politics. It's playing dangerous games, when what we actually need is a government that's dealing with the cost of living crisis, that's giving us a decent energy policy, that actually is able to run the country. And this is a distraction that they're using, but it's on the international stage, it's a dangerous distraction.
It's also worth saying, Ben, that kind of echoes something you said a second ago, that actually I'm pretty sure that Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, when they were doing those head-to-heads for who gets the big gig, turns out both of them got it, one for a shorter period of time. But they of course, they both said, I think, when asked about this, that they would probably on balance remain wedded to the convention.
Well, one thing Natalie and I agree on is the government hasn't got the ability, it has the ability, any government has the ability to leave. It hasn't got the courage or wherewithal to do it, even though I believe it's the right thing to do. And I don't agree with Natalie that we should be aligning ourselves with any countries. We are the United Kingdom. We invented human rights. We established human rights in all the countries you cited. Absolute nonsense that we need to be part of some convention with a whole load of historically warring European countries to which we brought peace. Yeah. In order to be seen as an upholder of human rights.
Well, I mean, Natalie, there's 46 or 47 council members of this convention, and there are some, fairly iffy members in there as well today.
Like Turkey.
Well, indeed. So, but if you leave it, Natalie, is there not a part of you that thinks, maybe we are grown up enough to do our own thing in this country? Why don't you trust British judges?
What I trust is a long-term development system, international system of human rights and the rule of law, which this is, the ECHR is one of the first one. We're seeing this developed more and more in international norms, things like the Magnitsky-style sanctions, things like the campaign to create an international offensive ecocide. We've developed over decades a real framework from people campaigning, from lawyers, from peoples working together to give us a world that's fair, just and safe for everyone in it. And that's what human rights and the rule of law are all about.
All right.
The world to which Natalie refers is a world where democracies are stripped of authority and these institutions are empowered. And these are all unaccountable institutions, including the European Union, the ECHR, the WHO, to a significant extent the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, all these institutions which are continually grabbing power from their member states, empowering themselves, denuding authorities of their local parliaments, of our parliament, and we've got to pull some of that power back domestically to the United Kingdom so we have a proper democratic system. Actually, what Natalie is proposing is anti-democratic.
Maybe we need a bigger system, Natalie, like a kind of a court that represents the entire Milky Way, so that we can override all of these institutions and areas and really we won't just go global, we'll go intergalactic perhaps. Natalie Bennett, thank you. Former leader of the Green Party, Ben Habib. He, of course, is former Brexit Party MEP.